I never thought I'd be writing this. Honestly, this is something I wouldn't believe if it hadn't happened to me. But after everything that went down that weekend, I feel like I need to tell someone. I've been having nightmares ever since we got back, and maybe getting this out will help. It started like any other college weekend getaway. You know, the kind where you just want to get away from everything. No homework, no noise, no distractions. My buddy James found this beach online, said it was one of those hidden gems. You know, the kind of place tourists don't know about yet. It was perfect. Just a few hours drive from campus, and it looked completely secluded. The pictures showed this beautiful shoreline with rocky cliffs on one side, trees on the other, and nothing but ocean in front. We were all in. Me, James, Sarah, Luke, and Emily. We packed up some tents, food, beers, the usual stuff, and hit the road. The drive started out fun, but it got weird the closer we got to the beach. The road turned into this narrow, winding path through a thick forest. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. No street signs, no other cars, just trees closing in on both sides. The GPS cut out at some point, but James swore he knew where we were going. When we finally arrived, I thought we'd made a mistake. The place was deserted, like completely empty. No other cars, no people, just nothing. It was kind of creepy, but also cool, I guess. It felt like we had the whole beach to ourselves. We set up camp close to the cliffs, thinking the rocks would block the wind and give us some privacy. Looking back now, that was the first bad decision. The first night was when things started to get strange. We had a campfire going, and it was around midnight when we all heard it, the whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it sounded human, like actual voices coming from the cliffs. Luke grabbed a flashlight, and we all decided to check it out. But when we got close to the cliffs, the whispering stopped. Just like that. Silence. We didn't see anything, so we figured it was probably just our imagination. We went back to the fire, laughed it off, and tried not to think about it. But I swear, every time the fire flickered, I could feel eyes on us, like we weren't alone. The next morning, things got worse. James went for a swim in the ocean, while the rest of us were still waking up. After about an hour, we realized he hadn't come back. We started calling for him, thinking maybe he'd wandered off down the shore or something, but there was no answer. That's when we noticed something that made my stomach drop. His clothes were still on the sand, right where he'd left them, but James was gone. We searched for hours, walking up and down the beach, calling his name, but he'd vanished. Then Sarah found something. There were wet footprints leading from the water up to the cliffs. They were James's size, no doubt about it, but they just stopped. There was no sign of him, no drag marks, nothing. Just his footprints, ending at the base of the cliffs. We called the local police, but they didn't show up until hours later. By then, it was almost dark. They did a quick sweep of the area, but didn't find anything. They said maybe he'd drowned or wandered off, but that didn't make sense. We knew James. He was a strong swimmer, and there was no reason for him to climb the cliffs. They left, saying they'd continue the search in the morning, but I could tell they didn't really believe us. That night was worse. The whispering came back, but this time it was louder. It felt like it was all around us, coming from the cliffs, the trees, even the ocean. None of us could sleep. Around 3 a.m., we heard footsteps outside our tents. We all jumped up, thinking it was James, but when we got outside, we saw nothing, just more wet footprints, leading from the water up to the cliffs again. But this time, there were more of them, and they weren't James's. By morning, Sarah was gone. She'd been in her tent right next to mine, and I didn't hear a thing. Her stuff was still there, untouched, but she was gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. We panicked. We packed up as fast as we could, but when we tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. It was like the battery was dead, but it had been working fine when we got there. That's when we realized we were trapped. The whispers were constant now, louder and clearer. They were calling our names. Emily started crying, saying she could hear her own voice in the whispers, begging for help. Luke tried to get a signal on his phone, but nothing worked. We decided to make a break for it. Luke thought we could hike back through the forest and maybe find help along the road. But before we even got to the tree line, Emily vanished. 1 second she was there, right behind me, and the next she was just gone. No scream, no sound, just gone. Luke lost it. He started shouting, running toward the cliffs, saying he could hear them calling him. I tried to stop him, but he was too fast. He climbed the rocks like a man possessed, and then he jumped. I ran after him, but when I got to the edge, there was no sign of him. Just the ocean crashing against the rocks below. I was alone, completely alone. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the water, waiting for the whispers to take me too, but they didn't. Instead, I heard a voice, a real voice, calling my name. It was the police. They'd come back in the morning to check on us, and they found me sitting there, dazed and half out of my mind. They never found the others. The official report says they drowned, but I know that's not true. I can still hear the whispers sometimes, especially at night when it's quiet. They're calling me back to the cliffs. I always thought the idea of a haunted house was just something from movies or books. You know, the kind of stuff that scares you as a kid but feels ridiculous as an adult. But after what happened to me and my family this summer, I'm not so sure anymore. I can't shake it. I can't stop thinking about that beach house. It started as a dream vacation. My wife, our 2 kids, and I rented this house on a stretch of beach, way out of the way from the usual tourist spots. We wanted peace, quiet, just some time to unwind. The listing online had photos that looked like something out of a postcard. White sand, clear water, and this charming little beach house. We couldn't believe our luck when we booked it for 2 weeks. The owner's price was surprisingly cheap for a place like that, but we didn't question it. We should have. When we arrived, it looked just like the pictures. Almost too perfect, you know? Like it didn't belong in real life. There was no one else around for miles, which was kind of nice at first. No screaming kids, no crowds, just the sound of the waves crashing in. But as soon as we got inside, things started feeling off. The house had this weird energy to it. I can't explain it, but you ever walk into a place and feel like you're not alone, even when there's no one there? It was like that. My wife said I was just being paranoid because of how isolated it was, but the kids felt it too. They said the house smelled funny, like old, wet wood and something else, something sour. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the sea air getting into the place. The first night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises. At first I thought it was the wind, but it didn't sound right. It was like footsteps, but not inside, outside, on the sand. I got up and looked out the window, and I swear I saw something, just a shadow, maybe a person standing near the water, staring out into the ocean. But when I blinked, they were gone. I didn't want to freak my family out, so I didn't mention it. The next morning, things got weirder. We found these footprints in the sand, leading from the water right up to the porch. They were big, too big to be from any of us, and the tide hadn't washed them away like it should have. My wife laughed it off, said it was probably some local kids messing around, but we hadn't seen anyone else since we got there. Later that day, we went exploring, and that's when we ran into one of the locals. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, sitting by a little bait shop down the road. We made small talk, told him we were renting the house for a couple of weeks, and I swear, the minute I mentioned the house, his face changed. He got real quiet, like he didn't want to say too much. He just told us to be careful out there, said the place had a history. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and mumbled something about the ocean taking what it wants. It was cryptic as hell, but again, I brushed it off. My wife thought he was just some crazy old man trying to scare the tourists. That night, though, things got worse. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were closer, much closer, right outside the window. I got up and checked, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But I could feel it. Something was watching us. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. A few days later, my son found something. It was an old diary, tucked away behind some loose boards in the living room. The pages were yellowed and falling apart, but we could still read most of it. It belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived there with her husband years ago. As we flipped through it, the entries got darker and darker. At first, it was just normal stuff, talking about the weather, their life by the beach. But then she started writing about her husband seeing things, strange figures on the beach, whispers in the night, and how he was slowly losing his mind. The last few pages were frantic. She wrote about her husband disappearing, how she could hear his voice calling to her from the ocean, begging her to join him. The final entry was barely legible, but the last sentence stuck with me. The sea wants what's ours. It's coming for me next. After we read that, everything changed. The noises at night got louder. We started seeing things, shadows moving through the house, cold spots that chilled us to the bone. My daughter said she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed one night, just watching her. She didn't tell us until later because she thought we wouldn't believe her. Then one night, my wife woke me up, shaking me. She said she heard someone, whispering outside. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to check. The footprints were back, leading straight into the water. But this time, there were 2 sets, one large and one small. When I came back inside, the house felt different. heavier, like the air was thicker. My wife wanted to leave right then, but it was the middle of the night and I wasn't sure if the car would even make it back to town in the dark. So we stayed, but none of us slept. The next morning, we packed up and left as fast as we could. We didn't care about getting a refund. We just wanted to get out of there. But as we were driving away, I looked back at the house one last time, and I swear I saw a figure standing on the porch watching us leave, just standing there like they'd been waiting for us the whole time. This happened a few years ago when I took a temporary job as a lighthouse keeper. I'd never done anything like that before, but I was in between jobs and it sounded kind of peaceful. The lighthouse was on this remote island off the coast of Maine, and I figured it would be nice to get away from everything for a while. The island itself was small, maybe a mile across, covered in dense trees. There was just the lighthouse, a tiny one-room cabin for the keeper, and a dock for the supply boat. They told me it would just be me out there for a few months, alone with the foghorn, the light, and the ocean. I got dropped off on a cold, foggy day. The boat guy, Jerry, gave me a quick rundown of how the light worked. It was all automated now, but there was still some old machinery in the tower. I just had to make sure it ran smoothly, log any ships that passed, and check the generator once in a while. Easy enough, right? The first week was uneventful. The place was quiet, and the fog rolled in most nights. You could hear the waves crashing against the rocks constantly, and the foghorn would blare every so often, its low, moaning sound carrying across the water. I settled into a routine, reading books during the day, walking around the island, and checking the light at night. But one night, about a week in, the light flickered. I didn't think much of it at first, but then it flickered again, like it was struggling to stay on. I climbed up to the tower and checked the generator. Everything seemed fine. The light flickered a couple more times, then stayed on. I wrote it off as a glitch and went back to my cabin. The next night, it happened again, but this time the flicker lasted longer. I went up to check the light, and as I was up there, I looked out at the ocean. The fog was thicker than I'd ever seen, just a solid wall of white surrounding the island. It was creepy, but what caught my attention was something in the fog, a shadow, just barely visible. It was too far out to make out any details, but it looked like someone standing in the water, just staring. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light or my imagination. But when I looked again, it was still there, just a dark figure standing in the fog. My heart was racing at this point, and I just stood there, staring back, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The light flickered again, and when I looked back, the shadow was gone. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the fog, just watching. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that the isolation was getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few nights, the fog got thicker, and every time the light flickered, I'd catch glimpses of those shadows, sometimes just one, sometimes more. They were always far away, standing in the fog, never moving, never coming closer, but I could feel them watching me. One night, about 2 weeks into my stay, the light went out completely. I was reading in the cabin when everything went pitch black. The foghorn was still going, but the light was dead. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the lighthouse. The generator was working, but the light wouldn't turn back on. I climbed to the top of the tower, and that's when I saw it. The shadows in the fog, they were closer, much closer. This time, they were standing at the edge of the rocks, just at the shoreline. I could see them more clearly now, tall, dark figures, completely still. There had to be at least 5 or 6 of them, all just standing there, facing the lighthouse. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. I tried to turn the light back on, but it was dead. No matter what I did, the bulb wouldn't light. I stood in the tower for what felt like hours, watching those figures just stand there. They didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door, and stayed inside. All night, I could hear the foghorn blaring, but the light never came back on. Every time I peeked out the window, those figures were still there, closer each time, until they were just a few feet from the door. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to daylight. The fog was still there, but the figures were gone. I checked the lighthouse, and the light was working again, like nothing had happened. I didn't know what to think. Over the next few days, the fog lifted, and the shadows never came back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that island, that whatever those things were, they were still out there, waiting. When Jerry came back to pick me up at the end of my stay, I didn't say anything about what happened. I didn't want him to think I was crazy, But as we sailed away, I looked back at the lighthouse, and for just a split second, I swear I saw something standing at the edge of the rocks, watching us leave. I never went back.